I want you to imagine something with me for a moment. Picture this. You've been messaging someone you're interested in, checking your phone every few minutes, your heart skipping a beat every time it buzzes, only to feel that sinking disappointment when it's not them. You've been there, haven't you? We all have. That feeling of waiting, wondering, and wishing they would just respond. Today, I'm going to share something powerful with you, something that might change the way you think about relationships forever. The secret psychology of what happens when you stop chasing and start living, when you put down your phone and pick up your life. That's right, we're talking about the psychology behind creating space in relationships, what some might call ignoring. But I want to be clear from the start, this isn't about playing games or manipulating others. This is about understanding human psychology and applying it with integrity to create healthier, more balanced relationships. I remember a time in my youth when I was absolutely consumed by someone who barely gave me the time of day. I'd analyze every text, count the minutes between responses, and plan my entire day around the possibility of seeing them. Does this sound familiar to anyone? I see those nods. I was living in a state of constant anxiety, my self-worth completely tied to someone else's validation. It wasn't until I accidentally ignored them, I went camping for a weekend with no cell service, that something shifted. When I returned, they had sent multiple messages asking where I was, if everything was okay. That's when I realized something profound about human psychology. We value what we fear losing. We appreciate what isn't constantly available. And most importantly, we respect those who respect themselves enough to have boundaries and a life beyond just us. This isn't manipulation, it's human nature. And understanding it can transform your relationships. Now, I want to clarify something important before we go deeper. When I talk about ignoring, I'm not suggesting you ghost someone or treat them poorly. I'm talking about creating healthy space, focusing on your own growth, and not making someone else the center of your universe. This approach comes from a place of self-respect, not spite. Let's start with the science behind this phenomenon. Psychologists have studied something called intermittent reinforcement. It's when rewards come unpredictably rather than consistently. This creates a powerful response in our brains. Think about social media. Why do you check it so often? Because sometimes you get likes and comments, rewards, but not every time, making you check more frequently. The same principle applies in human relationships. When someone knows they can have your attention 24/7, no matter how they treat you, the human mind naturally begins to value that attention less, not because they're bad people, but because we're wired to pursue what requires effort to obtain. It's the same reason why free tickets to an event don't feel as special as ones you saved up for. You didn't have to work for them, so they don't carry the same weight. I learned this lesson the hard way, through years of putting others on pedestals, only to find myself feeling invisible and unappreciated. But when I started building a life that fulfilled me, pursuing my passions, strengthening my friendships, developing my skills, something magical happened. The very people who once seemed indifferent suddenly became interested. Why? Because I was no longer just an option waiting in the wings. I had become someone with a rich, full life. Someone who had something to offer beyond just adoration. This is the key I want to share with you today. Becoming so engaged with your own growth that your attention becomes valuable. Not because you're withholding it as punishment, but because you're investing it wisely in yourself and only sharing it with those who reciprocate your energy. Consider what happens when you're always available, always responding immediately, always prioritizing someone else above yourself. You're teaching them how to treat you. You're setting the precedent that your time, attention, and energy are less valuable than theirs. Is that the foundation you want for any relationship? I speak from experience when I say that learning to create space was one of the hardest but most transformative skills I've ever developed. It went against my natural instincts. I wanted to be there, to show how much I cared through constant presence. But I discovered that true presence isn't about quantity of time, it's about quality. It's about bringing your full, authentic self to interactions. And you can only do that when you've spent time nurturing that self. Think about oxygen masks on airplanes. They always tell you to secure your own before helping others. This isn't selfish, it's necessary. Because if you pass out from lack of oxygen, you can't help anyone else. The same principle applies to emotional energy. If you're constantly depleting yours without replenishment, what quality of connection can you truly offer? Now, I want to address something important, the difference between healthy space and playing games. If your intention is to make someone jealous or anxious, that's manipulation. But if your goal is to maintain your own well-being and create balanced, respectful relationships, that's self-care. The difference lies in your intention and how you communicate. Healthy space might look like taking a few hours to respond because you're engaged in something meaningful, not because you're counting minutes to make them sweat. It might mean declining an invitation because you've planned time for self-care, not because you're trying to seem busy. It's about authenticity, not strategy. I've noticed in my own life that when I communicate my boundaries clearly, I'll be hiking tomorrow and won't have cell service, or I'm focusing on work until 5 p.m. today. People actually respect me more, not less. Clear communication paired with consistent action builds trust. It shows you mean what you say and say what you mean. Let's talk about what happens psychologically when you stop being constantly available. First, you create space for desire to grow. Think about eating your favorite food. If you had it for every meal every day, would it still be your favorite? Probably not. The anticipation, the waiting, makes the experience more enjoyable. The same applies to human connection. Second, you allow the other person to miss you. This isn't about making them suffer. It's about giving them the opportunity to recognize your value in their life. When we're constantly present, we become like furniture, comfortable but often unnoticed. A little distance allows both people to appreciate what the other brings to the relationship. Third, and perhaps most importantly, you get to observe how they respond to your boundaries. Do they respect your space, or do they demand your attention on their terms? Their reaction tells you everything about whether this relationship has potential for healthy growth. I remember a relationship I had where the other person would become angry if I didn't respond within minutes. At first, I interpreted this as a sign of how much they cared, but with time and wisdom, I realized it was actually a red flag, a sign of control, not affection. True care includes respect for the other person's autonomy and space. Now, I want to address an important question. How do you know when you're creating healthy space versus when you're actually neglecting a relationship? The answer lies in balance and intention. Healthy space still includes quality connection. It's not about becoming cold or distant. It's about being more intentional with your energy. If you're truly interested in someone, you should absolutely engage with them, have meaningful conversations, make plans, show up consistently. But consistency doesn't mean constant availability. It means being reliable in your word and actions. If you say you'll call, call. If you make plans, keep them. This reliability builds far more trust than being available 24/7, but half present. I've found that the most fulfilling connections in my life are those where both people have rich, independent lives, but choose to share meaningful experiences. There's a beautiful tension there, the pull of individual purpose and the desire for connection. When both are honored, relationships thrive. Let's talk about the practical application of these principles. If you've been overavailable and want to create healthier patterns, don't just suddenly disappear. That's jarring and potentially hurtful. Instead, start gradually building your own life. Take up that hobby you've been postponing. Reconnect with friends you've neglected. Pursue goals you've backburnered. As you do this, you'll naturally have less time for constant communication, but the communication you do have will be more meaningful. Instead of sending 50 texts about nothing, you'll have a real conversation about the interesting things you both experienced while apart. I want to share something personal with you. Years ago, I was in a situation where I felt I had to constantly check in with someone to keep their interest. I was exhausted, anxious, and losing myself. My mentor asked me a question that changed everything. Would you want someone to be with you out of genuine desire or out of fear of losing you? The answer was obvious. True connection can't be forced or manipulated. It must be freely given and received. When you focus on becoming the best version of yourself, you naturally attract people who appreciate that version, not people you've convinced or manipulated into staying. This brings us to another important aspect of this psychology, self-perception. How you see yourself directly influences how others see you. If you perceive yourself as someone whose time and attention are valuable, others will likely adopt the same view. If you treat yourself as an afterthought, available whenever someone whistles, that's exactly how you'll be treated. I've witnessed this transformation in countless people I've mentored. They come feeling invisible, taken for granted, but as they begin investing in themselves, setting boundaries, and requiring reciprocity in their relationships, something shifts. The same people who once ignored them suddenly see them differently. Not because they played hard to get, but because they actually became harder to get. Their time now filled with purpose and self-development. The interesting paradox here is that by becoming less accessible in a quantitative sense, you become more valuable in a qualitative sense. Your presence carries more weight because it's backed by substance. You're not just there, you're there with something to offer, experiences, insights, energy that you've cultivated outside of the relationship. Now, let's address an important point. This approach isn't gender specific. I'm not suggesting this is how men should treat women or vice versa. This is about human psychology that applies across the board. Anyone can fall into patterns of overavailability and self-neglect, and anyone can benefit from creating healthier boundaries. The goal isn't to become unavailable, it's to become selectively available, to choose consciously where you invest your energy rather than dispersing it to whoever demands it loudest or makes you feel most insecure. I want to talk about something that often gets overlooked in this conversation, the role of fear. Many of us stay constantly available because we're afraid that if we don't respond immediately, someone will lose interest, afraid that if we're not always there, we'll be replaced, afraid that our value lies solely in our utility to others. This fear creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we operate from fear, we accept treatment that doesn't honor our worth, we send the message that we don't believe we deserve more, and unfortunately, people often take us at our self-assessment. Breaking this cycle requires courage, the courage to sit with the discomfort of potential rejection, the courage to risk someone walking away because your boundaries don't suit them, the courage to believe that the right connections will respect your space and reciprocate your energy. I remember the first time I declined plans because I had scheduled time for self-care. My hands were shaking as I sent the message. I was so accustomed to prioritizing others that choosing myself felt almost wrong. But the response I received was eye-opening. Good for you. Enjoy your time. No drama, no abandonment, just respect. It was a pivotal moment in reshaping how I approached relationships. Of course, not every situation resolves so neatly. Sometimes when you establish boundaries, people do walk away. And while that hurts, it's valuable information. It tells you that they were interested in what you could provide, not who you are. That's not a loss, it's clarity. Let's talk about the technology aspect of this dynamic, because it's significantly changed how we connect. In previous generations, constant availability wasn't even possible. If someone wasn't home when you called, you left a message and waited. There was natural space built into relationships. But now, with smartphones basically attached to our bodies, we're theoretically available every moment. This has created unprecedented pressure. I encourage you to think about the technological boundaries that might support healthier relationships. Maybe it's silencing notifications during dinner. Perhaps it's having phone-free mornings or evenings. It could be explaining to people in your life that you don't always respond immediately, and that's intentional, not negligent. When you create these technological boundaries, something remarkable happens. You become more present in your actual life, which makes you more interesting, grounded, and fulfilled when you do engage with others. The quality of your connections improves precisely because you're not always connected. Now, I want to be clear, creating space isn't about becoming cold or aloof. It's not about suppressing your natural enthusiasm or affection. It's about channeling that energy in ways that honor both yourself and the other person. It's about sharing your warmth from a place of fullness rather than seeking to fill an emptiness through external validation. Some of the most loving, connected people I know are also fiercely protective of their boundaries. They give generously of themselves, but from a place of choice rather than obligation or insecurity. Their love is all the more meaningful because it comes from freedom, not fear. Think about the people you most respect and admire. Are they constantly available to everyone? Or do they have clear priorities and boundaries? Do they seem desperate for approval or comfortable in their own skin? Most likely, the people you look up to have mastered this balance we're discussing. In my own journey, I've found that creating healthy space requires getting comfortable with myself. When we're constantly seeking external stimulation or validation, it's often because we're avoiding something within. Learning to enjoy your own company, to sit with your own thoughts, to find fulfillment in personal growth. These are the foundations of authentic connection with others. The quiet confidence that comes from self-acknowledgement is magnetic, not in a manipulative way, but in a deeply authentic one. When you know who you are and value your own company, others naturally want to be included in your world. You don't have to convince anyone of your worth. It becomes self-evident. Let's talk about reciprocity because it's central to this entire conversation. Healthy relationships involve mutual investment, both people putting in effort, showing interest, making time for connection. If you're constantly initiating, reaching out, and maintaining the relationship, something is imbalanced. Creating space often reveals whether this reciprocity exists. When you step back slightly, does the other person step forward? Do they initiate conversations, suggest plans, show curiosity about your life? Or does the connection fade as soon as you're not actively maintaining it? This information is invaluable, though sometimes painful to discover. I've coached many people through the disillusionment of realizing a relationship they valued was actually one-sided. But I've also witnessed the joy when they later form connections with true reciprocity. The contrast is stark, the freedom, ease, and genuine affection that come from mutual choice rather than pursuit and evasion. This brings us to an important truth. The goal of creating space isn't to make someone chase you, it's to create room for both people to choose each other freely without manipulation or obligation. When both people are autonomous, fulfilled individuals who could be fine on their own but choose to be together, that's where the magic happens. Sometimes people ask me, but what if creating space makes them lose interest completely? My response is always the same. Then they weren't truly interested in you to begin with. They were interested in the chase, the validation, or what you could provide them. Real interest persists through reasonable boundaries. It respects your autonomy while still seeking connection. I want to address something important, the difference between creating space and emotional withdrawal. Creating space comes from self-respect and healthy boundaries. Emotional withdrawal often comes from fear, hurt, or punishment. One is honest, the other is passive-aggressive. One creates possibility, the other creates distance. If you're creating space while secretly hoping the other person will panic and chase you, that's not healthy space. That's a strategy. And strategies eventually backfire because they're not founded on truth. The space you create should be genuine. Time you're actually using for self-development, not time you're spending checking your phone every 5 minutes to see if they've noticed your absence. The most powerful position in any relationship is one of genuine choice, being with someone because you want to, not because you need to for validation or completion. When both people operate from this place of choice rather than need, the relationship has tremendous potential for growth and fulfillment. I've seen relationships transform when both people embrace this truth. The anxiety fades, the game playing ceases. Instead, there's a rhythm of connection and autonomy, togetherness and independence. It's not perfect, no relationship is, but it's built on mutual respect rather than insecurity. Now, let's address another important aspect: consistency. Creating healthy space doesn't mean being unpredictable or unreliable. In fact, quite the opposite. The most attractive quality isn't mystery, it's consistent character. When your words and actions align, when you follow through on commitments, when you communicate clearly about your boundaries, that builds tremendous trust. I've found that the people who command the most respect in relationships aren't those who are hard to reach or unpredictable. They're those who are clear about their availability and consistent in their engagement. They might not be available 24/7, but when they say they'll be present, they fully are. This consistency extends to how you treat yourself as well. If you declare that you're focusing on self-improvement but abandon your goals as soon as someone texts, you're sending mixed messages to both the other person and yourself. Your commitments to yourself should be as non-negotiable as your commitments to others. I want to share an observation from my years of working with people on relationship patterns. Often, those who struggle most with creating healthy space are those who grew up with conditional love or inconsistent attention. If you learned early that your worth was tied to your usefulness or compliance, setting boundaries can feel terrifying. It can trigger deep fears of abandonment or rejection. Recognizing these patterns is the first step to healing them. Understanding that your need for constant validation isn't a character flaw, but a learned survival mechanism helps you approach change with compassion rather than judgment. You're not needy. You developed adaptive behaviors in response to your environment. Now, in adulthood, you can develop new behaviors that better serve your current reality. This healing isn't just about improving your romantic relationships. It ripples into every area of your life: your friendships, family relationships, professional interactions. When you value yourself appropriately, every relationship benefits from that solid foundation. Let's talk specifically about communication, because it's essential to creating healthy space without causing hurt. Clear, kind, honest communication makes all the difference between someone feeling respected versus rejected. I'm focusing on work today, but I'd love to catch up tomorrow feels very different from simply not responding until tomorrow. The key is being truthful rather than making excuses. If you're creating space to focus on yourself, say that. Don't invent emergencies or pretend to be busier than you are. Most people respect honesty, even if they don't love the boundary you're setting. And those who can't respect your honest boundaries are showing you important information about their character. I want to emphasize something crucial. Your value doesn't increase when you make yourself scarce. Your inherent worth as a human being is constant. What changes is people's perception of your value, and more importantly, your own perception of your value. When you treat your time and energy as precious resources, you begin to see them that way yourself. This shift in self-perception is where the real transformation happens. External validation becomes less necessary because you're providing that validation to yourself. You become the primary source of your sense of worth, not the opinions or attention of others. Let me share something personal again. The relationships where I felt most anxious and insecure were invariably those where I compromised my boundaries out of fear. The relationships where I felt most secure and valued were those where I maintained my sense of self throughout. This isn't coincidence, it's cause and effect. When you honor yourself, you create the conditions for others to do the same. Now, some practical guidance. If you've been overavailable and want to create healthier patterns, start small. Don't suddenly go from responding instantly to disappearing for days. That's jarring and potentially hurtful. Instead, gradually extend your response time. Take an hour before replying instead of seconds. Then a few hours. Use that time to engage with your life. Begin prioritizing activities that fulfill you. Schedule them as non-negotiable appointments with yourself. When you decline an invitation because you've committed to these appointments, you're not rejecting the person. You're honoring your commitments to yourself. This distinction matters both to you and to them. Pay attention to the anxiety that arises when you're not immediately available. Sit with it rather than acting on it. Notice the thoughts that come up. They'll forget about me. They'll find someone else. They'll be angry. Question these thoughts. Are they based in reality or fear? What evidence do you have that they're true? This inner work is just as important as the outer boundary setting, because if you're creating space externally while internally obsessing about their response, you're not actually creating healthy space. You're just creating stress for yourself. I want to address something important, the role of vulnerability in healthy relationships. Creating space doesn't mean never being vulnerable or never expressing your feelings. In fact, appropriate vulnerability is essential for deep connection. The key word is appropriate, sharing from a place of self-acknowledge rather than seeking validation. When you're secure in yourself, you can say, "I miss you," without it being a plea for reassurance. You can express disappointment without it being manipulation. You can share your desires without attaching your worth to whether they're fulfilled. This kind of clean vulnerability creates depth without dependency. I've observed that people who maintain healthy boundaries are actually more genuinely vulnerable than those who are overavailable, because their vulnerability comes from choice rather than need. It has an authenticity that resonates deeply. They're choosing to share themselves rather than using vulnerability as a strategy to secure attention. Let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in these discussions, the timeline of change. If you've been overavailable in a relationship for months or years, shifting the dynamic will take time. The other person has grown accustomed to your constant availability. They've built expectations based on past patterns. Changing those expectations requires patience and consistent communication. Some relationships can navigate this shift and emerge stronger. Others might not survive the change. But remember, a relationship that can only exist when you compromise your well-being isn't actually serving you, it's depleting you. Sometimes the loss of such connections, while painful, creates space for healthier ones to develop.